Well, good evening and afternoon, and good morning to our friends joining us from Asia. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I'm Director and Senior Fellow of the Indo-Pacific Program here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And welcome today to our session titled "Why Russia's War in Ukraine Matters to Canada and to Our Partners in the Indo-Pacific." It's a great pleasure to welcome you for what I'm sure will be another engaging discussion on a crucially important challenge facing Canada and our friends in the Indo-Pacific region. As many of you know, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, through our Canada and the Indo-Pacific initiative, continue to place significant attention to the importance of the Indo-Pacific and its nexus with Canada's own foreign policy interests. Over the past couple of years, we've hosted events and given a platform to key thought leaders across the region, highlighting the key stakes in the region and outlining the imperative for Canada to bolster its own engagement. So tonight, we're really delighted to have speakers from across the region. We have speakers today joining us from Tokyo, Japan, Sydney, Australia, and also from Singapore. So we are truly scoping the region. And they're going to be the true experts tonight. But before I pass the floor over and introduce them, I wanted to start with a couple data points to sort of frame the discussion that we're going to have tonight. The first, I think, is convergences with Russia's prosecution of a war in Ukraine with this part of the world, in the Indo-Pacific. Why is this important, and why do we see these convergences? And I think there's a number of different reasons. The first reason, I think, is that states in this part of the world worry, of course, that unilateral coercion from one big state to a small state and this unilateral change of the status quo will have implications for their part of the world. Of course, while there might not be value in direct comparisons to what's happening, for example, now in the Taiwan Strait, I think there is a significant worry right now from states in the Indo-Pacific that China, through its aggressive actions in the maritime domain, may look to use coercive actions against its neighbors, which it already has been doing over the past several years. The second thing I think that's important to keep in mind is how states in this region, which have found it complex and difficult to place sanctions, for example, on Russia in previous years, have actually taken the unprecedented step to put sanctions on Russia for its activities in Ukraine and its war in Ukraine. A key example of this, and we have some of the representatives tonight through our speakers, is the presence of the quote-unquote AP4, or the Asia-Pacific 4, leaders who attended the Madrid NATO summit at the end of June of this year. I think this is an important symbolization of the convergences, not just between the traditional transatlantic, but between the transatlantic and the Indo-Pacific. The second key element, which I think we'll get into today with our discussants, is the increasing coordination and convergence between Russia and China. Whether this is political, whether this is a reference to their limitless friendship, which was agreed at the Beijing Olympics, or whether this is much more operational and tactical, as we've seen with an uptick in military exercises, not just in Northeast Asia, but elsewhere in the Pacific. So this is another area that I hope that our presenters will dig into later in this discussion. So with that being said, let me quickly introduce our speakers, and apologies to all of them that I'll be giving the Coles Notes version of your distinguished biographies. But if I can start with Dr. Michito Sudoka from Japan. And Sudoka Sensei is currently an associate professor at Keio University and has had a range of different other distinguished affiliations at the National Institute of Defense Studies, where I also was able to spend some time, and also working in the Japanese embassy in Brussels before. He is an expert on all things Japan, Europe, Japan, NATO, and Michito, it's great to have you on board. Our second speaker is Dr. Gorana Grgic, and she is a jointly appointed senior lecturer at the Department of Government and International Relations at the University of Sydney, and also at the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney. So Gorana is an expert on all things, also looking at the Indo-Pacific and Europe. And Gorana, it's a real pleasure to have you join us tonight. And last, but definitely not least, is Dr. Frederick Kleem, who is a research fellow and lecturer at the RSIS in Singapore at NTU, And Fred, and we would love to hear a little bit more about your book that you've just published. Has just released his book, very aptly timed, entitled "Great Power Competition and Order Building in the Indo-Pacific Towards a New Indo-Pacific Equilibrium." So, Fred, it's a great pleasure to have you on board as well. If I can turn first to Michito for a little bit of a perspective from this on Tokyo, from Tokyo. Michito, you've spent a lot of time in your career, obviously, traversing between the Indo-Pacific and Europe. This is not a new issue to you, but I wonder if you can give us some initial insights from Tokyo, on the implications that Japan is thinking about with Russia's conflict in Ukraine, and how this impacts Japan's own national security strategy and thinking. As we've mentioned before, Japan towards the end of this year will be reformulating a lot of its national security strategy and key defense documents. What is the thinking currently in Tokyo on this?
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. Yes, for my 5 minute the initial remarks, let me say a few words on three things. And first is on the indivisibility of security between Europe and the Indo-Pacific. This is something that the Kishida government, Prime Minister Kishida, has been very much emphasizing in his address to the Shangri-La dialogue, and also when he attended the NATO summit in Madrid at the end of June. So we don't really think that the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is leading to China's invasion over Taiwan. The situation is not that simple, but still the indivisibility of security is something that we are very, very much looking at. One of the most remarkable elements of Japan's response to the war in Ukraine is the fact that the Tokyo is imposing a unprecedented level of economic sanctions against Russia. So there's a huge difference between Japan's reaction to Russia's annexation of Crimea back in 2014. So at that time, Japan was really hesitant to impose severe, substantial sanctions against Russia. But this time it's very different. Of course, the scale of Russia's action is this time it's very different, and also the regional and the extra-regional implications are much, much bigger. So the scene from Tokyo, actually, the one of the sort of messages from Tokyo by imposing sanctions on Russia this time is that we would expect at least a similar level of solidarity from European countries when something really serious happens in the Indo-Pacific region. So that is my first point. And the second point is that yes, the Jonathan mentioned the Japan's work on national security strategy, which is due to be adopted by the end of this year. And so the war in Ukraine has stimulated a lot of defense-related discussions in Japan, and one of which is about the idea of increasing defense budget. So despite the fact that Japan is in a very serious security environment, so we have North Korea, we have China, and also we should not forget the fact that Russia is also Japan's neighbor. So it's quite an unenviable a situation, but still we have been spending only about 1% of GDP on defense. So now the ruling party, the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, there are a lot of discussions and increasing number of politicians supporting the idea of spending 2% of GDP on defense. But I'm not quite optimistic about that. But at least it's quite true that in the wake of the war in Ukraine, that there are more and more public support for spending more on defense is also there, and that is a new development. And thirdly, a bit broader issue, which is about the U.S. allocation of assets and resources between the European theater, Euro-Atlantic theater, and Indo-Pacific theater, because of course the US is a huge power. US is needed both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific region, but the US defense assets and resources are not limitless, which means that there is some element of trade-off between the Europe and the Indo-Pacific, and or also you can also say that there is a certain element of competition between European US allies and Indo-Pacific US allies, competing for US attention and US assets and resources. So how we could handle this, that is, I think, a hugely important agenda for us. So yes, on the one hand, there's a certain element of competition between the regions, Europe and the Indo-Pacific, but for us to have a concrete discussion, what we need to figure out is what is really in short supply, and so what is the areas where there is the serious competition between the two regions, and in those areas actually are the areas where the allies, both in Europe and in the Pacific region, will need to focus on. So that sort of a discussion, I think, is very much needed now. So that's it for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Misha. That's really helpful. And, I think back, I think you're right. I mean, some of the challenges that Japan faces, it's not just China. It's the challenge, obviously, from North Korea, which is one example, I think, that with the international mindset and attention now being so spread thin, obviously, with the war in Ukraine, tensions over Taiwan, et cetera, that there unfortunately is not enough attention to the continuing destabilization, obviously, what's happening on the Korean Peninsula. But this is not lost on our Japanese friends, as you noted, and this is an everyday challenge that Japan must face. As it pertains to Russia, I find it interesting as well, dating back even to, I think, 2013 or 14, when Japan's inaugural national security strategy came out. You referenced, obviously, that at the end of this year, Japan will have its new revised national security strategy. But Russia was actually identified as a partner, as you remember. Part of that was political with former Prime Minister Abe. But how things have changed so much, obviously, in 9 years, where Russia will go from being identified as a partner to now, I'm sure, an adversary. And the biggest worry for the Japanese side likely is that coordination with China that Russia has will be one of the things that we can get into later in discussion. So thanks so much. And the last point that I found was very interesting, and I'd be interested in Grana and Fred's views eventually on this as well, was this issue of reciprocity and the idea that from Japan's perspective, of course, it's concerned about what's happening in Ukraine from a global order perspective and an international security perspective. But I think there's a sense of precedence and reciprocity of, if something were to happen in the Indo-Pacific theater, there's an expectation attached there with Japan's response that European friends and allies would also have at least a similar level of response to support Japan in such an example. So I thought that's an important point to make as well. And Garana, if I can move now down south to Sydney, Australia, and to get your opinion on these issues.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you and the entire team at the MLI for inviting me. And it's great to be with some of the familiar faces and to meet some new ones. So I would like to piggyback on what Michito ended up with, and this idea of the competition between the two theaters. I think this is a really important sort of point to make and to just reflect on where we've been over the past decade or so. So you would recall, and I don't want to go back into ancient history, but certainly around the basically the launch of the U.S. Asia Pacific, as it was known then, pivot or the rebalance, there were a lot of fears across the Euro-Atlantic area, basically, that the United States would no longer see Europe as the important theater, that basically all of its resources and attention would be rebalanced in a way that it hurts Europe. And we've seen, obviously, the events that happened subsequently that then made US, so to speak, come back, not least obviously because of the illegal annexation of Crimea on part of Russia, as well as the war that went on in the Donbas region, but also everything that was happening in the greater Middle East area that, again, siphoned off attention, if you wish. But I think that these days where we are at is qualitatively quite different space. There is this idea of a kind of single theater, if you wish, where basically there is a convergence now in strategic assessments on both the US side as well as Europeans, and then obviously joining the Indo-Pacific major powers, middle powers, who are seeing that there are a lot of sort of pushes and propellers for greater cooperation across these two theaters. So you might speak the sort of, if you look at the Biden administration, the kind of talk of democracy versus autocracy competition that's going on, or just basically what is spurred on by the Russia-China entente at the moment that basically connects these two theaters. So in that sense, I would say that we have slightly moved away from this zero sum, and that there is a lot more preparedness, at least, or lessons that are being learned as to what is going on in Europe could apply in the Indo-Pacific. And obviously we see that these days around the talk of what the lessons from Ukraine might be for China, right? Seeing how big of a strategic failure this has been for Russia, that hasn't essentially been able to do what it hoped to, kind of securing a swift victory, overthrowing the regime, and so on. And again, what sort of lessons this might imply in terms of what is going on in Taiwan. And obviously we have all been watching with great concern the events over the past couple of days, even this very day over the Taiwan Strait. So in that respect, while it's still to be determined, whether this entente between Russia and China is something, that is a true love or just a marriage of convenience for the time being, there is a sense for various reasons, then not just to do with this, that there has been a greater coming together between the partners in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theater. And maybe just one thing that's worth mentioning on the point around what Jonathan, you were asking about what our European friends might be doing in the Indo-Pacific to kind of help the cause of ensuring stability, of maintaining order. There are basically two views, and it depends kind of which school of international relations you would subscribe to. But one kind of view or the approach would be to say Europeans are now at this point where they need to wake up to the strategic reality of needing to develop their own capabilities, of being more strategically autonomous, and all that, kind of conversation that has been going on for quite some time, in order to basically free up the resources for the United States to be able to actually meaningfully pay attention to the Indo-Pacific. The other approach, the other view, and I would say that I would probably more lean towards that one, is that the competition in the Indo-Pacific, the relations in the Indo-Pacific in general, are not just about military defense, about traditional kind of hard security, and that there are a lot of strategies already that have been uncovered on part of European allies and partners, which actually speak to this very fact. And this is where Europeans could actually be quite useful, right? If we think about all of the ways that they can contribute to, and they already are, to things like development aid, infrastructure, development of the kind of involvement in the infrastructure diplomacy, in terms of the way that European Union, for instance, can speak like no other power on things that have to do with preserving the kind of rules of the road, if you wish. There is a lot more space there to be active then.
Thanks very much, Karina. That's really great insights, and I think a lot to chew on there. And I mean, your point taken in the U.S. and I mean Washington D.C. I think this is constantly a debate. I think between the Atlanticists and those who are more focused on Asia or the Indo-Pacific is trying to get this balance right. And I think, sitting here from the perch in Ottawa, and we may not have the heft, and we definitely don't have the heft of our neighbor to the south, but we are also a member of NATO that very markedly has an Atlantic and Pacific interest and equities, even though it may seem that we've sort of ignored those for some time. So I think that debate also is playing out here in Canada. A couple of things and points that maybe we can come to later that I thought were interesting that you mentioned was Europe's need to sort of continue to think about both theaters, even despite what's happening right now. I guess two sort of questions come to my mind on this, and they don't need to be answered right now. Number one is the will to do that engagement, and if there is will, how will that look? Does that look through the NATO context that we've touched a little bit about in the early parts of this discussion? Is it in a bilateral context? Is it in an EU context? Is it all of the above? How exactly does that look? And the second, and I think perhaps more complicated question in the wake of Russia's war in Ukraine is a capacity question. Is there capacity? Is there resources? And I really liked your last point on when it comes to capacity, that when we're talking capacity, and I often have this same discussion in Canada, it need not all be on the shoulders of the Navy or the military, but there's multiple ways to engage and to protect interests and to support friends and allies in this part of the world. Some of that can be done through development and infrastructure, as you pointed out. So thank you very much, Garena, for those insights. I'm now going to pass it along, last but certainly not least, to Fred. And Fred, I think you can tie this up really well, obviously, from your experience in Europe, but also now sitting there in Singapore and having the perspective from ASEAN. So we've talked about a lot of the different mechanisms that could be used in this context, but we haven't really mentioned ASEAN so far. So I would be interested in your perspective on how states in ASEAN have been responding to this crisis of Russia's war in Ukraine, how they see the implications in the Indo-Pacific, and how the other partners in the region, including the AP4, including Canada and the United States, have to react to that and have to take that into account. So Fred, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really appreciate it. Thank you. I'm still avidly, keenly taking notes of what my colleagues just mentioned. It's really fascinating, and I'm particularly interested in this question of EU contributions. Perhaps we can later speak about this a bit in the discussion. This being one of my ongoing research projects as well. So I thought about what can I contribute, right? And you just mentioned ASEAN, and kindly enough, you also mentioned my book in the introduction. And I don't want to make thanks for that promo, by the way. I don't want to get into too much detail here, but the important bit is here ASEAN, right? So I see ASEAN, whether we like it or not, whether we think ASEAN is effective or not, I see ASEAN as a inevitable fundamental pillar of a future security order in the Indo-Pacific. And this is why it is so important to understand what ASEAN and ASEAN member states, of course, ASEAN not being much more than the sum of the will of its member states, think about this specific crisis in Ukraine, right? So I want to address this here because I have been mapping and categorizing Southeast Asian responses in quite a lot of detail and investigate motives for different responses, right? So in my short time, I just sum it up very basically. I think important is here that everybody in Southeast Asia recognizes the importance of this, or rather the impact of this conflict on our region, right? The impact here is pretty much the same as it is everywhere, right? Compounding already pre-existing crises, right? I don't need to mention all of them. You're all very much aware of this. On the other hand, we have, of course, Russia being one of ASEAN dialogues, one of ASEAN's dialogue partner, and a very important and very valued member, like it or not, of all forums here that make up the multilateral architecture of the Indo-Pacific, if you like, almost all of it being ASEAN-based, of course. So I have to be a bit of a contrarian here when I speak about ASEAN as it relates to the two previous speakers, because from a Southeast Asian perspective, this indivisibility, I guess, of the two theaters, the indivisibility of security between Europe, the Europe-Atlantic area, and the Indo-Pacific is not shared in Southeast Asia very much. From summing up a bit provocatively, from a Southeast Asian perspective, this is a war in Europe that has very precious little to do with us here. And of course, Japan, Australia, those are these perspectives are, of course, Asian perspectives, but they're not Southeast Asian perspectives. And the Southeast Asian perspective is very different. So I have to point out here that Singapore is the notable exception here, of course, right? Singapore is the only ASEAN member state that signs up to the Western view, if you like, right? The view of the political West, and indeed has enacted its own sanctions and gone along with it. But that makes Singapore an exception rather than the rule here in Southeast Asia, right? On the other end of the spectrum, if you think about it as a spectrum of responses, right? On the other extreme end is, of course, Myanmar, whose State Administration Council, as they call it, right? For you and I, the military junta in Myanmar fully supports the Russian invasion and has even spoken of Russia defending its legitimate security interests. They have invited key military figures after the key Russian military figures after the invasion to take part in military parades in Myanmar and so forth, right? So here you see a great level of support, perhaps repaying a diplomatic favor that Russia paid them, recognizing the junta. I think it's the first state that recognizes the junta as legitimate government. So the other 8 ASEAN member states are somewhere in between, right? So they're I've grouped them into 2 groups depending on the strengths, or rather the reservedness of their response to the war, right? And these 2 groups are somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. But I say the middle, but I'm happy to go about it in a bit more detail later if anyone is interested. But the middle here is not really the middle. It is actually being more closer to Myanmar, if you again imagine the spectrum, than it is to Singapore. So we have all the other countries being rather reserved and even shying away from calling it a war, speaking about conflict, rather speaking about the Ukraine-Russia situation, right? We have nobody naming, other than Singapore, of course, nobody identifying who's the aggressor, who is the victim here, right? This being, of course, standard language in the Euro-Atlantic area, right? It is very clear to Europeans and NATO members, I guess, and NATO partners, who's the aggressor, who's the victim here. Well, it is not so clear if you would follow Southeast Asian discourse, right? So we're seeing a very different perspective here from the NATO or the Western perspective. I think the main important takeaway here is to understand that Russia is not seen as an enemy here. In Southeast Asia, and I say we, just speaking broadly for Southeast Asia, Singapore being my home, Russia is not seen as the enemy here. This is being seen really as a conflict that is being fought between NATO and Ukraine on the one side, and then Russia on the other side, right? But it also tells us a bit about this, and I think this myth has been debunked already a bit, right? But it perhaps merits mention again because it is quite a strong topic of discussion here. This democracy versus autocracy binarism doesn't really fly in Southeast Asia at all, right? Not only that it doesn't apply logically, it doesn't really make much sense. So one of the key questions that comes up here is, if we take my research at face value and believe that other than Singapore, all the other countries have been either supporting Russia even, or most of them being very reserved in their statements and trying to stay neutral. The question is, what motivates this overall restraint, right? And the first logical hypothesis, and this is indeed the hypothesis that I hear quite a lot from my European friends and American friends, is that, oh yeah, of course, they depend on Moscow to some extent, right? So Vietnam is often mentioned, but also, of course, Myanmar. So there is so the logical assumption would be the depth of bilateral ties would somehow determine the response of the government. And I have investigated this in very much detail, detail. And while there is some correlation, it doesn't hold up as a monocausal explanation. And I think if we're seeking to understand these responses, we have to understand ASEAN. And yes, bilateral ties do make bilateral ties to the Kremlin, especially in the case of Myanmar, do make a difference, but they do not suffer as a full explanation. So there needs to be something else, right? And if we look into ASEAN history, into the history of Southeast Asia, there's, I think, two things that really stand out. And this is not an exhaustive list, but I believe those are the most important markers here. Just before I finish, I would like to highlight that ASEAN's tradition of neutrality and impartiality, right? So it has really started with Sophan, right, in the 1970s, the Sophan Declaration, trying to not take sides in the great power competition here during the Cold War, and then it moved on to ASEAN centrality. And I think among ASEAN diplomats, experts, especially from the West, may differ on this, but among ASEAN diplomats, it is very, very clear that ASEAN centrality, as we call ASEAN's sense of role in the region nowadays, is entirely based on, indeed contingent on ASEAN's being seen as impartial, right? And this includes such conflicts that are seen as being proxy wars between NATO and Russia on the other hand, right? And so you cannot expect this isolation of Russia that the West is pursuing to take any hold in Southeast Asia at all. I think that this would be very naive to expect this. And the second explanation, or rather the third explanation, would be a domestic preoccupation, right? So for Southeast Asia, for many Southeast Asian leaders, Singapore being to some limited extent, again, the exception, but for most leaders in Southeast Asia, everything that happens beyond Southeast Asia is none of our business. Right, that's really the main perspective here. So being the contrarian to my previous speakers, the theaters not being seen as linked at all, that as again the difference to the Western perspective, right? So it has precious little to do with us, and we can focus here on regional ties. And interestingly, most important are domestic considerations. I'll give you one example before I stop. I know my time is up. The often seen as the unofficial leader, perhaps, of ASEAN, and indeed the next ASEAN chair as of next year, Indonesia, they have been speaking about this war quite a lot in terms of public diplomacy. And of course, as you know, President Bapak Jokowi went to see Vladimir Putin and Zelensky after the G7 meeting, and he and key figures of his cabinet, they refer to this as a situation, as a conflict, Ukraine-Russia conflict, again, not identifying who's the aggressor, who's the victim here, but in every single reference they make to this war, what we call war, it is about the let's put it this way, the upset of post-pandemic economic recovery, right? It is not about the fate of the Ukrainian people. It is not about international norms. It is not about violation of sovereignty. When Indonesian key figures, and this is quite representative for ASEAN except Singapore, when key figures speak about this conflict, they refer to it in the context of how it derails the still nascent economic recovery post the pandemic. And I think this tells you quite a lot about how domestic priorities kind of inhibit a stronger position in foreign policy. So again, I'm happy to speak more in detail on this and also on EU contributions to the Indo-Pacific if anyone is interested. But I wanted to put a bit of a different perspective out here, and I leave it here, Jonathan. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Fred. That's really helpful, and I mean, I think a reality check, frankly, a sobering reality check of the different views in the region, which I think is important. And I mean, one of the things that I've been saying about whether it's India, whether it's states in ASEAN, and how they've approached this, is we can disagree, but we shouldn't be surprised, especially those who travel in this part of the world, who've had these engagements. I think if we feign surprise, I think that's not genuine. Disagreement's another thing, but this should not come as a surprise to us. One of the comments that came from a recent conference that I was in, and perhaps others here on this discussion, was the idea that European conflicts are seen as global conflicts, but global conflicts are not European conflicts. And I think that sort of highlighting what you were saying there, Fred, how, and frankly, this is something that India often references as well when it gets chastised for its response to Russia's war in Ukraine. I think it will often point out when we're having our conflicts, whether it's on the LOC with China or elsewhere, we're hearing very little in terms of support from our European allies and friends. so-called allies, that why should we be forced to do the same thing? And I think this sort of leads into a bit of my first question, and maybe Fred, I'll go to you first, and then to Michito. Is this a fragmentation of the whole concept of the Indo-Pacific? For me, it's not. I think that inherent in the Indo-Pacific is built in this flexibility and understanding, especially for states in the region. Japan, obviously, one of the intellectual figures that the origin of this Indo-Pacific concept, with the free and open Indo-Pacific, and realizing the different perspectives in ASEAN. Fred, where I think you've just articulated India, which I touched a little bit on. I think there's inherent room for these different opinions and views. But is this conflict, is Russia's war in Ukraine sort of highlighting some of these divergences? Some of these views, and is this compatible with an Indo-Pacific concept that encompasses the views of India, of ASEAN, of Japan, of South Korea? Will this be possible to be sustainable, or is this an example of where perhaps this is biting off too much to chew, in a sense? So maybe if I can start with Fred on this, and then move to Michito on it.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly, but I tried to answer it, and feel free to follow up if I misrepresent what you were asking. So I think yes and no. So it does highlight to some extent, of course, the divisions that exist, but those are divisions that are divisions on general foreign policy. On foreign policy perspectives in general, right? Between countries such as Japan and India, but also between countries such as Japan and the countries of Southeast Asia, right? For Southeast Asians, it was actually very difficult for ASEAN to come up with this outlook on the Indo-Pacific, as you possibly know yourself, Jonathan. Some countries in this region do not support the Indo-Pacific notion at all, right? And Cambodia, I think, had the greatest difficulty with agreeing to calling it the Indo-Pacific, whereas other countries here in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, were quite forward-leaning on this. So I think beyond the phrasing and the terms, most countries here in this region, and I think perhaps Australia is to some extent an exception, but most countries here in this region would agree on what a future order in the Indo-Pacific should look like. And this is, of course, taking account and being to some extent inclusive of China. And I do not want to speak to Japan, having two eminent Japan experts here, of course, but I think I would presume that this includes Japan as well, realizing that we cannot just wish China away, right? So we need a regional order that to some extent includes China, but also includes a very meaningful, robust presence of the United States. And I think, at least behind closed doors, everybody can agree more or less on this, right? So to what extent the Indo-Pacific is connected with other areas in the world, right? Especially with Euro-Atlantic security, there you will get the great differences. And perhaps one last thing on Russia. To what extent does the war in Ukraine, Russia's war in Ukraine, matter for the concept of the Indo-Pacific as it from a regional perspective here? And I would say from Japan's perspective, I'm presuming from Japan's perspective, it matters quite a great deal, right? Because Japan, of course, has their own problems with Russia, completely irrespective of Ukraine, and Japan is signing up very much to the Western and the NATO perspective on this conflict. But as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, it doesn't matter very much. So Russia still has a meaningful role to play in the Indo-Pacific from a Southeast Asian perspective, and they are a dialogue partner, and they will remain a dialogue partner, and they will not be isolated. So perhaps in short, yes, there are differences as it pertains to global security in general and the perspective on global security, but I would say the visions of a future order for the Indo-Pacific is very much shared by everyone, and I would actually even include India in this. Thanks, Jonathan.
Well, thanks, Fred. And moving to Michito, and just to sort of elaborate a little bit more on my point here is, and I guess using India as an example, Michito, is we've heard criticism, obviously, in the West on India's response to Russia's war in Ukraine. From my own perspective, the principal reason that we need to engage India is our convergences in the Indo-Pacific, whether that's the Quad or whether that's elsewhere. Obviously, Japan has a very mature relationship with India. Fred has explained some of the different views in ASEAN, for example, on Russia's war in Ukraine as well. I don't think it's as big of an issue in Japan, but I'd like you to articulate this. But I do worry a bit from the Western perspective, whether they sort of precondition or almost caveat their support for this larger Indo-Pacific concept with the actions of, for example, India and the reactions to India in this conflict in Russia's war in Ukraine, or the views of ASEAN, or whether they're focusing it on the region itself and the views in the region. So I wonder if you could sort of answer this, whether from Japan's perspective, they're more concerned about, for example, finding convergences with ASEAN and India in the Indo-Pacific, or whether they're worried about the viewpoints, even though they might be different from India and ASEAN, as an example, with Russia's war in Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Starting from a broader picture, the Indo-Pacific region has never been quite united. So the divergences or fragmentation are not really new. So that's one thing. And also Fred is quite right that in Southeast Asia, the war in Ukraine is not a central topic that everyone is talking about today. No, we are very, very much looking at the of course ASEAN itself, but also the situation over Taiwan and China's activities and US and US-China strategic competition, and so these are bigger issues for many in the Indo-Pacific region. So the fragmentation, yes, but the primary reason for that hasn't. I wouldn't say nothing to do with Russia, but it's not quite about Russia. So it's more about China and the US, and that's just a reality. And as for India, there was at the initial stage, there was a huge level of frustration or disappointment about India's reaction to the war in Ukraine. But after that, after some weeks or some months, then we now understand India's positions. But still, even if India is not quite interested in imposing sanctions on Russia, for example, but still we very much recognize the importance of India and getting India involved in Quad framework or in other frameworks as well. So the India's frustration or India's suspicion are very much understandable, because from India's perspective, they know that the Western countries, Europe or United States, will not help India in its conflict with China, for example. So India needs to deal with its own situation, its own security problems by itself. So for that purpose, vis-a-vis China, of course, India cannot afford to alienating Russia. Not only as a supply of weapons, but also in political terms as well. So India doesn't want to see India doesn't want to find itself in a situation where India needs to confront Chinese and confront Russians at the same time. It's India's nightmare. So I very much and we very much many people in the region understand India's position. One more thing is that yes, it's quite true that out of nearly 200 countries in the world, only 40-some countries are imposing sanctions on Russia. So the Russians are saying that the President Putin and others are saying that Russia is not isolated. Yes, that's a bit of propaganda, but still, the reality is that the countries imposing sanctions on Russia are cannot be seen as a majority of the world. So that's just a reality. So from that perspective, it's really important, as Fred mentions, that the emphasizing that this war is about between democracies versus authoritarianism, authoritarian states. I don't think it's quite helpful. So in terms of thinking about the increasing the number of countries against Russia, I think it's counterproductive for us to emphasize the democracy or freedom or value aspect of this war. And actually, the Tokyo is very much aware of this, and that is why Prime Minister Kishida, while on one hand emphasizing the indivisibility of security between Europe and the Pacific region, but at the same time he doesn't use this democracy discourse or values or freedom discourse when we talk to particularly Southeast Asians. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michito. Garana, did you have some views on this? Obviously, Australia has invested a lot, particularly in the relationship with India via the Quad, and I would imagine there would be similarities in some sense to Japan's approach at really prioritizing that relationship in an Indo-Pacific framework, and with the focus obviously being on managing China rather than necessarily hectoring India for its actions or lack of actions vis-a-vis Russia's war in Ukraine. But I wanted to sort of get your thoughts on this as well.
Sure. And yes, I also had two fingers on a couple of points there that Fred made. And I really found the discussion of ASEAN very insightful. And I think it's always important to kind of not assume the kind of monolithic or uniform approach all across the Indo-Pacific. And I think if any part of the Indo-Pacific specifically proves that point, it is the ASEAN countries. But on the specific note of Australia's approach to partnerships in the region, I think that this was already well articulated and set in place back in 2017 with Australia's white paper on foreign from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, where it singles out Japan, South Korea, India, and Indonesia as the key partners in the region in seeing through the idea of the kind of open, or Australia's version of open and free Indo-Pacific. And obviously, this has only been augmented and deepened with some of the initiatives like the Quad, notwithstanding, obviously, the fact that there are, again, one should not assume always the uniformity of views, and the fact that it is the war in Ukraine, actually, that tests the stance of the Quad. And clearly, I would like to go back to 2 points on one, first, the kind of global democracy versus autocracy struggle. It's interesting that in Australia, at least, we do have a buy-in from the government. And actually, we've had a change of government where both the coalition and now the Labour government speak this language. So are very much hand in hand with the US in terms of seeing what is going on in European East as a struggle between autocracies and democracies. And obviously, there are a lot of problems with that. There is also, I mean, if you just take a look at, for instance, New Zealand, it looks at that from a completely different perspective. So even at this point, speaking from the antipodes, the views aren't necessarily all the same. And there was an issue, I mean, with the whole framing of democracy versus autocracy well before the invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing war. We know that, if you want to, and I think Michito made a great point there with just if you want to build a coalition, if you want to have people come on board, you might be putting off a lot of them by speaking this sort of language because not necessarily everyone subscribes to these ideas or might see this as a kind of cloaked imperialist talk, and you really end up then building a much smaller club rather than a coalition of like-minded countries. And we see that sometimes more as a kind of more preferable term, not necessarily democracies banding together, but like-minded countries, right, that are in favor of preserving at least what is left of the kind of international order, or some of the institutions and kind of norms that have been underpinning it. So in that sense, well, I would say Australia leans more towards the kind of agenda for democracy on part of the US. I think that there is a cognizance that it doesn't necessarily fare and travel well all across the world, and in fact not across the region here either. But now very quickly on a point that Fred made around, and Jonathan, you alluded to this fact that Europeans tend to see European wars and problems as global problems, but it doesn't necessarily go with the kind of the other way around. When the rest of the world is struggling, Europe doesn't necessarily always pay the greatest attention. And there is a lot of truth there, and I think a lot of frustration on part of those that then seem to be left behind. But I would say in terms of the interconnectivity of theaters, what we are seeing these days in terms of basically inflation and kind of global energy crisis that has really hit hard even the countries that don't necessarily want to be dragged into the conflict or don't want to be forced to choose sides. We see that obviously a lot of the emerging and developing countries in Asia are net importers of gas, of oil, of metals, and they have been particularly vulnerable to the rising commodity prices. So in that sense, I would probably be a bit more reluctant to say that they have nothing to do, or that this crisis doesn't concern them necessarily, because if anything, all of the sort of projections that we have these days in terms of the way that the balance sheets will look like and the macroeconomic outlook for these countries is that this will inevitably weaken their growth, weaken their currencies, make their current account balances worse off. So in that sense, while they might not take a stance, certainly what's going on in Europe is having an impact and is reverberating far, far beyond European East.
Thanks very much, Karina. That's some really good points, and especially on energy security. I mean, that's something that we've been hearing quite significantly here in Canada, obviously, with significant ability and resources, but unfortunately not the ability to get those resources out to our friends and allies, either in the Pacific or the Atlantic. And I think that's something we're grappling with right now, is what contribution can we have right now to the crisis and the war of today, but ideally also proactively thinking about what the crisis, we hope it's not a war, but any potential crisis in the Indo-Pacific. The reality is that these things take time. You can't just do it and prepare the week after, but they take years and sometimes decades of preparation and infrastructure. And I think from a Canadian perspective, this is something we really acutely need to be aware of, is especially on the energy security and critical minerals side. I also liked your point on the ideology, and this was brought up a couple times about democracy versus autocracy, especially in this part of the world. It's going to be a pretty small list if you only end up going, with the pure democracies. And in the end of the day, I think if you think of this as a ledger, a bank ledger, I mean, it's a balance of interests. Where is the balance of interests? The interests are not necessarily identical. It's not a mirror image. Michito mentioned this earlier, that whether it's fragmentation, whether it's different views, I mean, this is okay. This is how the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific has been for many years and will continue to be so. But if that ledger of interests has more interests with a group of states, I think that's the area that we should be focusing on, rather than necessarily identical political systems. So one last question, and before we have a lot of interest from the audience here as well, so I want to get them involved with some of their questions. But I did want to touch very quickly on the Russia-China dynamic, and maybe Grana, I'll go to you first on this. Is, how serious, we talked a little bit about, the political dimensions of this. I mentioned obviously the statement in Beijing, and we can say whether this is a marriage of convenience, and in many ways I think it is, but I think there's also something more to this. I guess rather than thinking about where this is right now, where do you see this going in the future? I'm a little bit alarmed at, for example, some of the military coordination, and Grant, after you, I'd like to get Michito's opinion as well, because Japan obviously is facing some of this military coordination closely between Russia and China. Where exactly do you see this coordination going, in particular in the Indo-Pacific? Is this something primarily from a political side we have to worry about? Do you think Russia has the capacity in military terms, maybe not to be an existential security threat to players in the region, but to become a significant spoiler? And one of the examples I'll use of this, and I think there's several other ones, I think it might have been 3 or 4 years back when Russia accidentally flew over the airspace of the disputed island between Japan and South Korea. And of course, that required a South Korean response, which then required a Japanese diplomatic response. I mean, to be honest, this seems exactly the type of game that the Russians and the Chinese want to play, to wedge in between American allies. I think this is the one element that they do share, despite the fact that they have many differences. So where exactly do you see the extent of this coordination going? And is this something that the Europeans can play a role because of their obviously experience in dealing with Russia, as well as their desire to play a role to help out friends in the Indo-Pacific? So Garana, maybe if I can start with you, then Michito, and then Fred.
Sure. And obviously, I think we have to start with the fact that China and Russia these days are not in any way coy about the extent of their cooperation and coordination, having unveiled just at that first day of the Winter Olympics, the so-called No Limits partnership that basically just reinforces what has been happening over the past couple of years in terms of the increased sort of deepening of the ties between the two countries. I think it's important really to stress that they are different types of powers, right? As you, Jonathan, already alluded to, and that I think the Biden administration has made a good point of as well, stressing, unlike the Trump administration, which at least on this level of policy statements and proclamations tended to band China and Russia together as kind of like challenges or threats, whereas these days China is obviously seen as down the road strategic competitor, near peer competitor number one. Russia is a revisionist, but definitely a different type of challenge, a spoiler, as you've also mentioned. So in saying that, obviously we see then a partnership or an entente between qualitatively two very different powers that creates the kind of unease potentially for the one that is certainly in a junior position and certainly in way bigger dire straits at the moment, and that is Russia. But that obviously doesn't undermine it doesn't diminish from the fact that together still in coordination they can wreak havoc, and obviously they can siphon off a lot of attention, as Russia has certainly away from what is strategically more important. And to that point, I think that they are already doing, what China could be very grateful to Russia to an extent is for putting all of the attention onto European or Eastern flank, or NATO's Eastern flank in particular. And for a lot of the Indo-Pacific watchers, the strategic concept that was unveiled was a bit disappointing, because it seemed to signal that the US is in a way reinvesting in Europe after trying so hard again to rebalance to the Indo-Pacific. But at the same time, just to kind of offset some of this, I think that the Biden administration all throughout this time has made a point, unveiling the Indo-Pacific strategy just around the invasion of Ukraine, proceeding ahead with some of the very high-profile visits to the region, doing really a lot of things to say that they are aware of this coordination, again, that they are not necessarily dropping the ball, and again, trying to enlist European partners and allies onto this agenda. So this is, again, coming back to some of the introductory remarks that I made. I think that what we see, and what certainly China can see from the fact that a lot of us were surprised that there would be a lot of this cooperation going on in the Euro-Atlantic space, that this could potentially down the line equally come back to bite China. So that there are lessons from Ukraine in terms of the extent to which sanctions were unleashed, the extent to which there has been rallying behind Ukraine, that we could see translated in this theater. And again, that given the economic interdependencies, it wouldn't be a kind of fun and joyful ride for China. So in that sense, there are lessons, there are analogies, but equally there is a lot of distraction going on at the moment, if you think about the kind of broader sort of down the line big shifts that are happening in the international system.
Thanks very much, Brenda. That's really helpful. Michito, if I can turn to you, and I mean, just again, you referenced in your initial comments about how Japan is having a new national security strategy coming out at the end of this year, new national defense documents. And we talked about, obviously, the change from Russia from partner to, most likely adversary. How do you think Japan is viewing this in the coming years? Obviously, I think China still remains the main challenge of today, of tomorrow, of 5 years, of 10 years. But how much on a Russia-China coordination sense is this really going to be something that Japan needs to pay a lot of attention to? My own sense is I don't think it fundamentally changes the security threats and concerns that Japan had last year or 2 years ago. But I do think it's a very new factor that Japan will need to take into account as it develops this new strategy. Love to get your thoughts on this.
No, thank you very much. Regardless of the actual direction of Russia-China relations, the still already the reality for Japan is that we will have to address 3 challenges simultaneously. So Russia challenge, China challenge, and North Korea challenge. So that's a lot. So that's going to be a really difficult period going forward. Looking at the China-Russia relations specifically, what is quite already evident is the fact that Russia is relying on China more and more, and China is already now a big brother in all the areas of the bilateral relationship, because up until the war in Ukraine, so when it comes to military and defense industry equipment in those areas, so Russia was far ahead than China, or at least the perceptions were like that. But now that sort of perception is gone. So the China is the big brother in all the areas, and that's a new situation, and we will have to adapt to that new reality. So that is why the weakening of Russia is in China's interest. But the problem here is that China still needs Russia in view of its strategic competition with the United States. So the weakening of Russia, at least up until to some extent, is in China's interest. But beyond that, the complete collapse of Russia, it will not be China's interest. So there's a sort of a dilemma that the Beijing is facing. And also this dilemma has to do with the China's relations with the United States as well, because the US, the Biden administration, has been warning China not to provide the military equipment to Russia. And this sort of a U.S. warning seems to have been quite effective. So as far as we understand that, China hasn't yet provided any substantial military equipment or things that could be used for military purposes. And this is quite understandable because for China, the helping Russia, yes, they might be important, but managing relations with the United States, I think, is still far more important. So China has a lot to lose from, for example, U.S. secondary sanctions against the Chinese tech companies, because Chinese tech companies are very much global companies. So they don't want to lose their business just for the sake of helping Russia. So this sort of a dilemma is there, and that is why I think the Chinese behavior has been quite cautious. And that's, for the moment, is a good news for us.
Thanks, Michita. I think that's a really good point. And I think, well, Russia has been able to leverage, obviously, its energy resources for, its weaponization of energy and its coercion of neighbors in Europe, obviously, with its energy supplies. I think you're right. I think China, frankly, has less to offer. Obviously, it does have monopolization on critical minerals, but it's very dependent on the West when it comes to technology. We do have dependencies, whether we can wean ourselves off them on manufactured goods and else from China. But I think that dependency scale is different when it comes to Russia. And I liked your point, too, about the junior and senior partner element. I would agree with you. It was at a recent conference that I heard that this saying that, essentially before the war, Russia was China's gas station. And now it's its discount store. It's a dollar shop, basically, discount shopping in Russia. So I would agree with you. I would argue even before its war in Ukraine, China was the senior partner. But that ledger and that balance has shifted even more towards China's favor, whether Russia likes it or not. So Fred, I wonder if I can turn to you quickly for some thoughts, and then I'm going to get to an audience question.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I don't have very much to add to my colleagues. I agree with all of them, with all they said. Perhaps two things. One thing that is often be neglected is, I think, a very good personal relationship between Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I think sometimes we underestimate, especially as realists, we underestimate the importance of personal relationships, and they seem to be pretty sound. I think this is something that is quite important. Another thing that I would like to say is that everybody who would be surprised by a closer Russia-China relationship has either not been paying attention or doesn't understand geopolitics, right? I mean, this is something that is absolutely to be expected, right? I'm a realist at heart, right? So what I study geography and I study interests, right? And so here we're getting to the essence of geopolitics, right? And if you just look at the map, it makes already perfect sense to understand that China, being junior partner or senior partner, it doesn't even matter, but that China needs, although I must of course agree that China is the senior partner here, but nonetheless, it makes perfect sense to have at least a very good working relationship with Russia, right? Because major strategic interests align between Russia and China, which is at least spoiling the supremacy of the United States and not signing up to the liberal international order as the United States define it. And second, look, what makes the state of America, what makes Canada even secure, right? It's those two big, massive oceans you have around you, right? What makes China secure? China is secure if they can secure the South China Sea, the first and perhaps second island chain, right? If they can be safe in the Pacific, and then on the other side, if they can be safe on Eurasia, right? And the Eurasian continent is what, 70? Okay, I'm guessing here, right? Roughly 70%. China and Russia, right? That's the Eurasian continent for you in terms of landmass, right? So it makes perfect sense from a geopolitical perspective to expect, whenever it's possible, despite some upsets, a good China-Russia relationship. And there was much speculation about whether China actually agreed to the invasion of Ukraine, or whether they liked it or whether they disliked it. I don't think it even matters. Personally, I think they probably disliked it a bit and they're not that happy with it, but it doesn't even matter because the overall interest and from a geopolitical point of view, converges, right? So we can expect good relations. And one last thing, I agree that weapon deliveries are unlikely, and China would try to limit the support for the war in Ukraine as much as possible. But one thing we need to bear in mind is that a humiliating defeat of Russia, as it looked possible at the beginning, now less likely, but it looked possible to some extent at the beginning of the conflict. A humiliating defeat of Russia in Ukraine would not be in China's interest at all. So I think if this would be a possibility, I think China might change their perspective on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Fred. Well, great insights, and we can continue this discussion, but I did want to get to a couple of the audience questions. And one of these, and again, we talked earlier that we don't necessarily draw a connect the dots line to Russia's war in Ukraine and the potential for conflict, for example, in the Taiwan Strait. But because this is a topical question and this is something our audience is very interested in, I wanted to get your sense. And Michito, I'll start with you on the current situation, the tensions surrounding Taiwan. And number one, where you see this going in the coming months, but also I think this connects with the idea of the European partners. And Michito, what you were mentioning earlier, the idea that there's some expectation of reciprocity in a sense with Japan's support and very quick emplacement of sanctions on Russia with the war in Ukraine, that if there is a potential contingency, the Europeans would be expected to provide some element of support, whether that's sanctions, whether that's some other sort of messaging. I guess my question here is on contingency planning, and not contingency planning on a necessarily a war or a conflict in the sense that I think many of us think of this, but how much are we thinking of the different sort of gray zone tactics? And we're already starting to see the first chapter of this. I mean, this book has been written for a long time, so maybe we're not in the first chapter, maybe we're in chapter 7 or 8. But are we prepared for dealing with below threshold challenges that I think we're seeing right now from China? Do we have any sort of coordinated way to respond to this? Clearly, we've seen the G7 statement as one sort of example, but is this something that we've been preparing for, not just with the Quad countries or those in the Indo-Pacific, not just in the US-Japan alliance or the Australians in tandem as well, but is this something that we should be working very closely with the Europeans on? Do you think that there's a need to have real serious contingency planning below the threshold of active kinetic warfare over Taiwan? So maybe, Michito, if I can sort of push this to you first, and then maybe Gorana and Fred can chip in on it.
Yes, of course, contingency planning, that's really important. And but particularly between the US and Japan, still the level of preparedness for us in view of contingencies in Taiwan is quite inadequate. So I think particularly for Japan, we need more time, but of course time is limited. So that's a huge problem. And my worry, looking at the latest development over Taiwan, my biggest worry is that the current level of tension could become a new normal. So and that could continue for some time. So that is I think a real possibility. So the Chinese missiles flying over Taiwan and that sort of thing. If this could really become a new normal, then the regional landscape, I think, is going to be very different. So I'm very much concerned about that. When it comes to European involvement, I don't see any real possibility for NATO as an alliance to get involved. But if something really serious happens, so the direct military confrontation between China and the United States, and then the US losing soldiers, and that's in such a situation, of course, individual European allies could get involved in one way or another, and particularly, of course, the United Kingdom, and it's highly likely for Britain to get involved in some way. So the individual European countries' involvement is something that we could think of, but I don't see any possibility of NATO's involvement. And one of the biggest and urgent and challenges for Japan is what we could do. And the experts and some politicians have been discussing this for some time already, but in legal terms and in political terms as well, I don't think we are prepared. So there's now a huge need for us to move this discussion forward. And one of the situations where we don't want to find ourselves in as for example, in terms of providing weapons. So the Germany was criticized a lot. So initially, that Germany was prepared only to send a few thousand helmets, for example, and that was very much ridiculed by NATO allies. And the Japanese situation is quite similar. So I'm not sure whether Japan can really quickly send thousands of helmets to Taiwan if something really serious happens. So so this is very much a huge homework. So that is why the contingency planning, and if a new legal framework is needed, and this is the time for Japan to really move things forward.
Thanks very much, Michito. And Goran, if I can turn to you, and I mean, I guess one of the points that comes out of Michito's comments too is it strikes me that a lot of this planning tends to be reactive. It tends to be in the form of diplomacy, and again, that's in many ways the only option. But I think when I'm thinking about contingency planning, some proactive thinking on this, and a lot of this messaging, the way that the message is delivered, especially the Chinese side, need not always be publicly. But I wonder if there's some coordination behind the scenes on some proactive discussions with the Chinese on which lines shouldn't be crossed. And I'm not referring only to naval lines or to the firing of missiles, but also in the realm of cyber elements, where China, when they're using their coercion now, they're using multiple tools, multiple verticals. And I think we're seeing this right now in the current response to Taiwan. I think that it's not just military exercises, but it's the use of cyber, it's the use of trade sanctions. And I think in Australia, you're familiar with the different elements of this coercion yourself in the China relationship. So I'm wondering if you feel that there's any sort of benefit of this sort of coordination to preemptively try to deter some of these actions.
That's a great question, and not just to kind of say to fill the space and try to find an answer, but I do think that it is important to come back to what I think manages any sort of relationship to remain at a point of stability and at least some sense of predictability, and that is keeping the lines of communication open, right? And basically making sure that you don't stop talking, and where you can, that you find a way to at least build some confidence in and instill it in the other side. So I think that there has been a lot of talk, as a student of transatlantic relations, at least on both sides of the Atlantic, about this kind of compartmentalization of China. And what I mean by this is these couple of tracks with which both the United States and its European counterparts try to engage with China. Obviously, European Union is famous for its kind of tripartite definition of China as both a partner and a competitor and a rival. But the United States as well, if we think about Biden administration's approach, talks about how China also could be, we should compete with China where we must, but we should also try to cooperate where we can. And this has been time and time again repeated in various settings, whether it was just in the early days of the administration, or even to, point to some of the areas of the commonality on, fighting the climate crisis, or potentially cooperating on arms control, non-proliferation, and similar sort of matters. So there is still space there, and I think this is exactly where the discussion, both in Washington and in capitals around Europe, is now splintering. The strategic reality is such that we are very firmly in an era of competition, of great power rivalry, right? That the history has kind of returned, right? This sort of narrative. But there are those who say there is absolutely no way of cooperating with China these days because its strategic goals are ultimately diametrical, right? It is a systemic rival. Or those that say there are still issues on which we have to see eye to eye, right? And some of them also pertain to the security domain. They are not necessarily some of these non-traditional security issues. Now, in terms of contingencies and forward sort of planning, I can just speak to Australia's experiences of a couple of days ago, because Australia has just launched its strategic review into the Australian Defence Forces. So the first one of that kind after nearly a decade. And this basically builds on the Defence White Paper from 2016 and then the Defence Update from 2020. And I think it's worth pointing out that one of the leaders of this process, who was the former chief of the Australian Defence Forces, said that the strategic environment is the worst that he has ever seen in his lifetime. And what's more is that back in 2020, when the Defense Strategic Update was launched, it observed for the first time that Australia is now within the 10-year window of basically having a threat, a kind of credible threat to its security. So back when the first Defense White Paper was launched in 1987, it basically was premised on the fact that if any country was meaning to do Australia harm, it would be given a 10-year warning, right? This was a very sort of nice and kind of almost optimistic view of the future. But now the consensus is that we are no longer in that territory, that there is no longer a 10-year warning, and that Australia needs to get serious about looking at its capabilities, at its force structure as well as posture. And so in that sense, in terms of planning ahead, at least some serious discussions are being had. But obviously we are going to see what happens. Also, some of the things that are still up in the air is where AUKUS is going to take Australia, which type of subs it opts for, what to do with the so-called capability gap that arises in this period of time when the old subs are phased out and new ones haven't arrived and similar.
Thanks very much, Karina. And that's an interesting point on the 10-year warning. I think we're sometimes even more benevolent here in Canada, and we give adversaries a 100-year warning or so. But the reality is often we don't even have 10 seconds or 10 minutes to analyze some of these challenges. So I think you're right on this. Fred, quickly to turn to you on this, and I just wanted to ask one last question. So if you could just sum this up in a couple seconds. But it strikes me, and I was in Europe the day in February 24th, obviously when Russia had its full-scale invasion, and I remember seeing the ashen and white faces of my European colleagues, seeing the intelligence, seeing the television like all of the rest of us beforehand, but not expecting Vladimir Putin to take this actual step. And the reason I go back to this on contingencies has this definitely been a lesson. And while whether it's Taiwan, whether it's an issue in the Korean Peninsula, whether it's somewhere else in the Indo-Pacific, should this be a warning? Maybe the stakes are less. But one example I'll point to, whether it's a contingency over Taiwan, is the presence of EU citizens, for example. and non-combatant evacuations. I mean, there are a multitude of different factors and interests here, and some of them are quite significant in a human capacity level. Is this something that the Europeans should be more and more concerned about in the wake of this war in Ukraine?
Yeah. Yeah, can you hear me? Sorry, there was just a little upset. Yeah. Okay, excellent. Sorry. Yeah, Jonathan, look, all of us students of international relations, right? We would all hope that contingency planning is always being done and we are all well prepared for everything, but the reality is absolutely zero is happening, right? You'd be shocked how little contingency planning there is in Europe. And even for the most strategically forward-thinking countries like France and Great Britain, there is literally zero, right? So, of course, it should be a warning sign. It was to be expected, according to intelligence analysis, that Vladimir Putin would go to such length, and yet it took everybody in Europe at least by surprise. And I guarantee you, it will be exactly the same thing in Taiwan should an invasion there ever happen. Right? So perhaps what you mentioned, the humanitarian aspect of this crisis, of course, and I think this is something that can be done relatively easily because Europe will draw on. This would be my advice anyway. Europe will draw on the relatively decent maritime infrastructure France has in the region, and I think Europeans and France would help out European partners in terms of evacuation and so forth, if that is even possible, right? Depending on how an invasion would take place of Taiwan, right? It may not even be possible. So I think one thing that Europe, the most important thing Europe should think about is, look, what would this actually entail for Europe in terms of contributions to the United States and Japanese and Australian effort to sort of mitigate or fight a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Europe cannot really realistically contribute anything in terms of hard assets, right? But what Europe will have to do is there will be some sort of talk about sanctions regimes against the PRC, right? So if you now think Europe needs to go along with it, of course they need to go along with it. But if you think the dependence, especially Germany's dependence on Russia is great and has done a lot of damage, and it's difficult to keep up the sanctions and maintain popular support in Germany for those sanctions, you'd be very surprised how dependent the German economy is on China, right? So this would be a whole different ballgame. And I don't think we've even begun discussing this in Europe. To what extent this will impact the economy in Europe, and I think this is something they really need to get their head around. But once again, international relations is events-driven, Jonathan, as we all know. So a contingency planning is virtually absent. I think we would just remain to be reactive until the end of our days.
Thanks, Fred. Yeah, we all wish we had the crystal ball. Unfortunately, we don't. So we're in rapid fire round at this point. We only have a few minutes left, but I did want to end on a quick question on Canada. And it strikes me, and even though he was misquoted, I thought this interview was interesting. I think the Financial Times several months back quoted the U.S. Secretary of Defense in his discussions with the UK counterparts as saying that perhaps the UK should focus its resources more on Europe, on the transatlantic, and less on the Indo-Pacific. At the same time that the UK is tilting more towards the Indo-Pacific, or thinking more towards the Indo-Pacific. And the reason I use this reference is Canada also is a country that obviously is a NATO member. Most of its experience and expertise traditionally has been used in the European theater. We're currently leading a mission in Latvia on NATO's eastern flank. But at the same point, we're wanting to tilt towards the Indo-Pacific. We're very much hoping a strategy for this part of the world comes out soon. So what would be your advice for the Canadian side about making this balance? Personally, I think that we need to do both, that it's an imperative to do both. And I don't think that we should lose sight of the economic center of gravity and the economic center the center for geostrategy, which will be the Indo-Pacific, despite obviously our commitments and connections to our European friends. But what's your sense as scholars that are sitting in the Indo-Pacific on what role Canada should play? Should we be more focused on the transatlantic as we traditionally have, or should we finally take this moment to shift our attention much more in a balanced sense to Asia. So if I can do very quick, maybe a minute each, and start with Michito, then Gorana, then Fred.
Yes, of course, Canada is a transatlantic country, and the Canada's commitment to Latvia is really important. But at the same time, Canada is an Indo-Pacific power as well, so facing the Pacific Ocean. So you cannot choose, actually. So you are already present in both regions. So the keeping engagement in the Indo-Pacific region, I think, is in Canada's own interest. So that is why that I expect that is going to continue. And one final point about the related to that. One final point is that the way in which we could deal with contingencies, and that is very much being observed by not only by China but also other potential adversaries as well. So what we need to do is to make a clear distinction between allies and non-allies. So they're making Beijing, for example, believe that Taiwan is very different from Ukraine. So when it comes to NATO, the distinguishing Ukraine and Poland and Baltic states, NATO countries, the NATO has been quite successful in persuading Russians that the intervention in NATO is going to be a very different thing than war in Ukraine. So where Taiwan is situated, not a formal ally, but still different from Ukraine. But how we could make Beijing believe that Taiwan is different from Ukraine, so much closer to formal allies. So that is a big challenge. And of course, Canada as a NATO ally is very much a part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michito. Gorana.
I would just say that Canada has probably a similar sort of position or could be drawing on what Australia has been doing, and that is also not just to make it about security, but also about economic cooperation, and obviously being part of the CPTPP and being involved in the kind of trade in this part of the world, to tap into that, given that, again, in terms of the capabilities, potentially it can't, match some of the major powers in the region, by no means, but certainly it can play a very important role in preserving the rules and also from benefiting, obviously, from what is the most economically vibrant region of the world.
Thanks so much, Gorana. And Fred, you have the last word.
Wow, what an honor. What an honor. Thank you. So first of all, I mean, who am I to give Canada advice, right? But one of the things that I find striking about Canada is its incredible amount of soft power, right? Everybody likes Canada, right? And you should really, I mean, so Canada is really seen as well in the Atlantic area as well as in the Indo-Pacific. Really, Canada has an incredible amount of appeal, right? And I think my humble suggestion would be to not ruin this with becoming too robust too soon, right? So what I'm saying here is, have your ear on the ground in the Indo-Pacific, right? Engage a lot with Track 2. I think a lot of stuff in the Indo-Pacific, a lot of the frank and honest discussions in the Indo-Pacific take place on Track 2 level, and engage with Track 2 and ear on the ground that way. And I believe that this way you will find out very, very quickly that what is not wanted here in this region is a strong and robust military presence. If by countries like Canada, for example, if we have anything of too much of, then this is a militarization of our region here, right? I mean, we have far too much of this. So instead, I think if you would put your ear on the ground, you would hear very much that multilateralism is not yet dead. Right? Try to prop up the multilateral structures and the channels of communications that do exist here in this region. And I'm thinking, of course, of ASEAN here, right? So try to engage with ASEAN a lot more beyond just lip service. Try to resist this urge of minilateral security cooperation among self-selecting partners, but try to really invest in multilateralism that exists here in this region. And the last thing on Atlantic, of course, I mean, Canada is a very valued part of Euro-Atlantic security, right? But ultimately, I think continental security at least needs to be in Europe's hand eventually. And I know we've been talking about this for a long time, and there are stumbling blocks, but perhaps we're moving into the right direction now. If there's anything good that can come out of this terrible war, then it is perhaps that Europe can get its act together on providing continental Euro-Atlantic security. Thanks, Jonathan.
Well, thanks so much, Fred. And I think, so summing things up, and thanks to Grana and Michito as well, and harking back, Michito, to your comment just recently, I mean, this isn't an either or choice. There's reality sometimes, and geography informs those realities. And we are a Pacific and Atlantic nation, and we didn't get time today, but maybe in the next discussion to talk about the Arctic, which is also a profound challenge in reality for the Canadian side as well. So thank you so much to all three of you. I hope next time we're able to do this in person, and hopefully at the next time that we actually will have delivered an Indo-Pacific strategy where we can get your comments and sharp analysis on Canada's newly released strategic approach to this part of the world. So thank you so much, and good night to our audience, and thank you so much for sticking with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, Jonathan.